This is Take 5 with JK Strategies.
Welcome, friends, to Take 5. This is Jack Calvertinis, where we get a chance to speak to leaders in business, law, and policy about key issues of the day. And I'm very happy to welcome today friend and fellow Demon Deacon, Bobby Burchfield.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks for having me. This should be fun.
We've shared some wonderful moments when it comes to Wake Forest, some disappointments as well over the years, but win or lose, I think we've always enjoyed the ride.
Exactly, we have, and it's been quite a ride.
Recently, as you define it, you've retired from the law after an incredible 40 years as a trial and appellate lawyer. You've tried cases and argued throughout the country for companies and organizations, including two First Amendment key cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Two cases that I understand are studied in law schools across the country. You've represented three presidents, the Senate Majority Leader, the House Majority Leader, and numerous other federal and state officials.
That's correct. It's been a career that I could not have scripted at the outset, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
Incredible. Let's talk about community service. And when it comes to community service, you've done so much. But sadly, some might say that a commitment to community service is, unusual for a conservative. And as a fellow conservative, that upsets me because that has never made sense to me. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, Jack, as you know, I am an unapologetic capitalist, and I don't think community service is the least bit inconsistent with that. In fact, some of the great programs that are of most aid to our less fortunate people in this country and throughout the world are driven not by government but by private giving. Many of our organizations throughout this country are effective in what they do by the volunteer commitments of very busy business leaders. So I don't think there's any inconsistency or not even any tension between capitalism and community service. Indeed, I think it goes hand in hand. Subject of a longer conversation, perhaps, but you can put me down as an unapologetic capitalist.
Nice. Well, I know the service that you've performed and the way you've given back to Wake Forest. Could you talk about that and the other areas where you've given back?
Well, I've been involved with Wake Forest for over 30 years. I served a couple of terms on the Alumni Council and ultimately was the president of the Wake Forest Alumni Council. In 2004, I joined the Board of Trustees, and I'm now in my fourth four-year term on the Board of Trustees. I've tried to be there when alma mater needed me, and I hope I've made a bit of a difference at the school.
What about some of the other groups that you've been involved with where you've given back? Because it's very impressive. And one I know happens to be the Boy Scouts, but if you could just elaborate on some of the other areas.
Sure. As with Wake Forest, I've tried to be involved with my law school. I was a charter member of the Dean's Board of Advisors there, remain on that to this day. We'll talk in a few minutes perhaps about the course that I taught there this past semester. I've been involved with the Boy Scouts. That's a fairly recent commitment of mine, but I'm on the executive board of the National Capital Area Council of the Boy Scouts. I'm an Eagle Scout. It means a lot to me. It meant a lot to me as I went through my life. And I think if you were to try to find an outstanding statement of rules to live by, the Boy Scout oath would be a pretty darn good place to start. And then I also serve as the chairman of a couple of super PACs here in town that are run by my good friend Stephen Law.
And Stephen and I worked at the Department of Labor together when he was deputy secretary. And a quick note about GW is that both my father-in-law and my brother-in-law are both graduates of the medical school and very proud GW medical school grads.
Well, that's great. My experience with medical school at George Washington was that as a first-year law student, I was having a bit of trouble with my throat, so I went to the clinic over there to get tested for strep throat. And as the resident was swabbing my throat, he was trying to make small talk, asking what I did, and I said, "Well, I'm a first-year law student," and he said, "Wow, you must really be working your ass off." And I thought immediately, this guy probably hasn't been to bed for 36 hours, and he's telling me I'm working hard. And that's when it occurred to me, Jack, that lawyers, for all their great virtues, do tend to be complainers.
Well, it's funny because when I was in law school at Catholic U, my brother-in-law was at GW, and he was my medical witness in my moot court trial.
Oh, my goodness.
Even though I never argued and won cases like you did in real life, I did that day with him as my GW medical witness. Let's talk a little bit about philanthropy. You are quite philanthropic, and I really want to hear your views of giving back.
Well, it's a heritage in my family of giving back. Both my parents were very active in their church and in their communities. We lived in 7 different communities before I graduated high school, and they lived in one more after I left. My dad did a lot of things in his community, but one of the things that I found most outstanding when I was going through his personal effects after he passed away, I found his blood donation card. And as it turned out, my dad had given 261 pints of blood in his life, which is giving blood every time you're allowed to give for a period over 40 years. That amounts to about 33 gallons of blood. And if you think about the fact that they use a pint of blood and they break it down and it can benefit numerous people, the number of people my dad helped by that small, selfless, and really not advertised act was immensely helpful to his community. My mom similarly has been involved in every community activity that she could possibly be involved in during her life. She's still with us at the age of 94. So I have it in my heredity to be philanthropic and oriented toward community. In addition, going back to Wake Forest, when I graduated from Wake Forest, the commencement address was given by the then president of Auburn University, Dr. Henry Philpott, and the topic of his conversation was noblesse oblige. Those who have received much, from those who have received much, much is expected, and I think that's a good rule to live by.
Wow, a family tradition. And by the way, my mom is 95 and still with us. Let's turn to the very important topic of free speech, and really want to understand from you, why is free speech so important to you?
Well, it's not important just to me. I think it's important to our way of life. Without free speech, you cannot have free and informed elections. You cannot have debate about important government policies. You can't have criticism of your existing office holders. You can't discuss religion. You can't even have free markets and free commerce without free speech. So it's pretty fundamental to the way we live, and it is unfortunately today under some assault. And so when I retired, I announced as my passion in retirement that I was going to do what I could to promote free speech and civil discussion.
I'm going to do the air quotes for retirement for you. But how do you distinguish between free speech and the First Amendment? Because I know people use the two terms interchangeably.
That's a great question. The First Amendment is both broader than the concept of free speech and narrower than the concept of free speech. It's broader in the sense that the First Amendment contains a number of other rights. It contains the right to free press, to practice religion freely and against state establishment of religion, to assemble peaceably, freedom of the press, and also free speech. So it's broader than just the concept of free speech, although free speech does underlie many of those other concepts. But free speech is broader than the First Amendment in the sense that the First Amendment only restricts the government from interfering with free speech. Some of the most challenging issues we are seeing today in the free speech arena involve private action, not government action. And although those are not subject to the First Amendment, they can be subject to other legal remedies depending on the circumstances.
Thank you. Well, that's a good segue into the next thing I just wanted to ask you, because you mentioned how it's been under assault, and if you could just maybe elaborate on that, on what you see as the principal challenges right now to free speech.
Well, we discussed in my course this past semester at GW a continuing presence in the course was Joe Rogan, who has been a controversial figure and who many have tried to have tried to kick off the air. That he's still on the air, thankfully, and has resisted that, but not without some concessions to the anti-free speech crowd. A number of his episodes from his library have been taken down. We also talked about Dave Chappelle and the campaign against him because he offended some people in one of his comedy routines. If you look back at the history, particularly the history since the 50s and 60s, some of the great social change in this country has been motivated and spurred by comedians, and to hold them to a standard of not offending anyone. I mean, that we might as well stop laughing.
Very good point. And actually, where are the other comedians? I mean, it seems to me like Seinfeld has done a good job, Jerry Seinfeld, of pushing back, but so many others are sadly silent. And these are people, especially the late night comedians, who have so much to say on a daily basis. You know, I thought of Dave Chappelle the other day because I drove by the school that he has sponsored in Georgetown, and the incredible donation that he made to the school, and yet that in and of itself became a controversy, as opposed to accepting this incredible generosity from him.
Right. Well, it's the effort to cancel speech can occur in many forms, and many of those forms that it occurs are unfortunate.
Well, let's really get to the meat of this discussion and talk about what you are doing yourself to promote free speech, the study of it, promoting it, and defending it.
Well, since I retired, I've done three things that are I think important in the free speech arena. The first is that I did teach a seminar at George Washington Law School this past semester. It was a 7-session, 2-hour per session course, and we front-loaded it so the students finished it halfway through the semester so they can go about their other courses in the second half. I think they all liked that front-loading, and I certainly did because I have my spring free. I also have begun some financial support for the Institute for Humane Studies, which is affiliated with George Mason University. They do some very fine work in the area of supporting free speech, open dialogue, and free enterprise more generally. And then the final thing I did was announced just last week, which is I have endowed a professorship of First Amendment free speech at George Washington, it's the first fully endowed professorship the law school has ever had.
We're going to talk about that, but your generosity on that is remarkable. Let's talk about this seminar, because I really want to learn more about this. I know you told me before the show about it, and I thought how special this is for the students that are taking it. But if you could just talk to us a little bit about the seminar.
Sure. There's no textbook out there that taught the course I wanted to teach, and so I had to assemble my own materials. Ultimately, it was a lot more work than I thought I was taking on, but I really enjoyed every minute of it. Ultimately, I came up with some materials that showed students, I hoped in a fairly neutral way, the best arguments in favor of free and unrestricted speech, and then some relatively contemporary arguments by thoughtful people about why we should restrict particular kinds of speech.
Yeah, if we could just dig into that a little bit, because I love how you said neutral, because frankly, I believe that every professor of any sort, whether they're tenured, whether instructors, should always seek to do that. So tell me about how you created that kind of balance in this class and the curriculum, the books that you assigned.
It was a challenge, Jack, after being an advocate for 40 years, taking positions and arguing them as vigorously as I could, stepping back and then being the neutral in a subject that I feel so passionately about myself was a challenge. And you'd have to ask the students. I doubt I was scrupulously neutral in every circumstance, but I certainly tried to be, and I think largely I was. Starting with the reading list, I wanted to be balanced, and so the first 2 sessions we read some of the great thinkers and great advocates of unrestricted speech. John Stuart Mill, 2nd chapter of On Liberty. It should be required reading for everyone in this country. The best, I think it's still the single best argument in favor of free speech. We read James Madison's resolution of the Virginia legislature opposing the Alien and Seditions Act. James Madison, the author of the Bill of Rights, very much an authority on First Amendment free speech. And then we read Alexis De Tocqueville. And De Tocqueville was, as you know, Jack, you studied him at Wake Forest, as did I, was a very astute observer of America in its early days. He was writing in the 1830s, almost 200 years ago, and I singled out the chapter where he talked about free press in the United States. He talked about the essence, the essential internal embedment of free speech in the American character, even at that early stage.
I mean, the 1830s.
Yes.
I mean, I have to sometimes remind myself that he wasn't writing this at the end of the century in the 1890s, or it was, our country was so young, but he nailed it early.
And his observations are still very astute. My view is that his observations about the American commitment to free speech have remained at the core of the American psyche up to this day. And one of my concerns, frankly, and why my commitment to free speech is that I am concerned that we may be losing that innate commitment now. So I thought it was important to introduce the students to de Tocqueville and get them thinking about that.
That's so fantastic. And just one more note, and you mentioned that we studied at Wake Forest. I mean, Professor John Reinhardt passed away, sadly. He made a real impression on me, and part of it was his assignment and then discussion of de Tocqueville. And the fact that I've gone into government affairs in my life, and I sometimes think about how he discussed the First Amendment and competing interests in this messy thing that we have in our country of everyone advocating for themselves, but in a free society, it generally all turns out better than if one were in a very different kind of society without free speech and without people being allowed to advocate for themselves and the groups that they belong to.
Absolutely. You can think of examples at almost every point in American history where there have been great debates in the country with passionate voices on both sides, everything from independence to the adoption of the Constitution, leading up to slavery, leading into the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, World War I, to the Civil Rights era, up to the present day where we're debating what the U.S. policy and NATO policy should be in Ukraine. And the great thing you can say looking back is, for those debates, which were largely unrestrained and often no-holds-barred debates, the country usually got to the right place, and that's the power of free speech.
Say amen, because that is so true. And this term cancel culture is, people sometimes forget, it's about canceling people's voice. And you just made a very compelling case that we should stand up against it. In fact, I don't care what someone's ideology is, whether they're liberal, moderate, or conservative, there should be sort of a unified front against this sense of let's cancel speech.
Right. Well, my class, to get back to the class quickly, my class did not study just the advocates for free speech. We also read some of the passionate and well-regarded advocates for restricting speech. We read Herbert Marcuse's essay, Repressive Tolerance. Herbert Marcuse was considered the founder of the New Left and an icon to the 1960s radical movement in this country. He advocated restricting speech so that the left could have a stronger voice. Jeremy Waldron published a book in about 10 years ago called The Harm in Hate Speech, where he argued for regulation of hate speech. And then Professor Seidman at Georgetown published a more recent article called Can Free Speech Be Progressive?, the first line of which is, the answer is no. And he points out all the reasons that, in his view at least, free speech tends to favor conservatives. I don't agree with any of them, but I at least wanted the students to see points of view different from the free speech advocates.
Good for you. And speaking of the students, what has their reaction been like?
The reaction has been, I think, in all respects favorable. We had vigorous, animated discussions in class, but the discussions were always civil and respectful. I told them at the end of the course that I really applaud them for that. That's the way we ought to have discussions in this country. We can disagree, but let's do it respectfully. I noticed both in the discussions during class and even in their papers that their thinking was evolving on this issue. And it's very satisfying to me to read a paper in which a student starts out perhaps arguing for placing restrictions on speech, and by the end of the paper, the student is saying, but I'm really not sure we should do this. So as they're thinking through the paper and writing down their thoughts, they're continuing to synthesize and analyze and frankly, I think, come to a more thoughtful place.
I love that. Well, we're going to wrap up, and I'm going to wrap up with a big picture question, which is, considering everything that you've said today and all of your commitment, this incredible gift to GW and this class that you're teaching, tell me, are you more pessimistic or optimistic as you look towards the future for our country and free speech?
I am an inveterate optimist. I think we're in a period now where the pendulum has swung, I hope, about as far as it's going to swing toward cancel culture and people and trigger zones and trying to protect people from things they don't want to hear. And I think we're starting to see the pendulum swing back to a recognition that if you isolate yourself from opinions you don't want to hear, you're never going to learn anything. Your thinking is never going to be evolved. You're never going to be challenged to fulfill your potential. At least I hope that's the way we're headed. So I am an optimist, Jack, and I'm very optimistic about the resilience of this country.
That is great, and that makes me more optimistic as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, Bobby. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Jack. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.